Hi everyone, welcome to the sixth webinar of the Singers Laboratory webinar series. My name's Saide. Today we're going to talk about Samuel Coleridge-Taylor and his music. This topic is something that I'm deeply passionate about. I wrote an entire thesis on this topic on one of his song cycles, and it took me 3 years. So I wanted to create a webinar about it, introduce him and some of his music to you. He was extremely famous during his time, and it's just strange and sad that his name is removed from textbooks, from concert halls, from lesson plans and things like that. So this webinar is just going to be an introduction. It's going to be short and sweet. I hope that it'll spark some interest and it'll start some conversations. But if there is anything that interests you in particular during this session, feel free to reach out to me and I'll guide you to the right resources. So a little bit of the order of the presentation so you know what I'll be discussing. I'm going to talk a little bit about Samuel Coleridge-Taylor's life very briefly. We'll discuss his compositional style and the development of it. We'll focus a little bit on his 6 sorrow songs, which is the song cycle I wrote my thesis about. I'll tell you very briefly about some of my findings and my research. I'll include some links and resources, and then we'll finish off the session with questions. So this is Samuel Coleridge-Taylor. He was born in London, England in 1875, and he passed away when he was only 37 years old. And he died of pneumonia in very few days, actually. It was very sudden. His name, a lot of people ask me questions about his name. It is close to Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He told his first biographer that that was not an accident. His mother was an avid poetry reader, so he was named after the poet. His family and close friends would call him Coleridge, actually, by his middle name. The hyphenation of his last name was a mistake of a publisher, but he continued to use it throughout his life as he was publishing more music. His mom was Alice Taylor. His dad was a Creole doctor named Daniel Peter Hughes Taylor. He was also in London. He had a practice, but his practice wasn't doing well because of the general distrust in doctors of color during that time. Because his practice wasn't doing well, he actually goes back to Sierra Leone. There are kind of contrasting accounts of whether or not Samuel Coleridge-Taylor met his father. Some say that he never met him, but some others say that his father lived with them until he was 1 year old. So he was the first in different aspects that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. He broke a lot of boundaries in a society that was weighed down by social injustices. From the letters that we have from his choir master as well as the headmaster of the Royal College of Music, it seems that he was the very first student of color admitted to this historically white academia. He was definitely the first conductor of color who had an international career, internationally acclaimed pieces of music. And in my thesis, I also mentioned how he was the first composer to have introduced musical genres of African music, the musical idioms of African music genres into the British musical scene of the time. First composer to have done that. So there is a lot of things. He had a lot of contributions, but his name, when I was studying, his name wasn't included in any of our textbooks. So that's very shocking. His musical training started with violin lessons, actually. His grandpa gave him a violin and some basics of the instrument. He was also a singer in a choir as a young boy. The choir master, Herbert Walters, noticed his talent. He actually offered to financially support his studies at the Royal College of Music. So Herbert Walters personally met with Grove, sent letters, and discussed his admission to the RCM, and he was admitted, and that's how it all started. During his studies, he met Jessie Walmsley, who was another student at the RCM, and they got married. In my research, I discussed how interracial marriages were not illegal, but they were frowned upon. Jessie Walmsley's family were not in support of this marriage. She actually has a book, and in the book she mentions how she would receive threats and letters, different things to actually force them apart. We also have an account of Coleridge-Taylor telling Jesse that he was kicked out of his father's house when he went to ask for blessing, basically. The son-in-law was there, and he specifically says, I was kicked out. So there was a lot of difficulty surrounding their marriage, but they lived a happy life. And there's a picture here of the family. On the right, there's Jesse Walmsley. There is their daughter, Gwendolyn, who changed her name to Avril later on. She was also a conductor, composer, very famous. I'm thinking to have a webinar only on her actually later on. And in the back, there is Hiawatha, their son. Early 20th century, in 1900, that was a very important year as it was the first Pan-African conference. Coleridge-Taylor was in attendance. A lot of different people of African descent joined to discuss many important topics, political, social, and otherwise. At the conference, W.E.B. Du Bois was also present. That's the first time that they met. A very important social activist. He wrote seminal books, and Coleridge-Taylor ended up reading his books. They became close friends to the point that Du Bois actually devoted a chapter of one of his books to Coleridge-Taylor after he passed away. A few years later, early 20th century, Coleridge-Taylor took 3 trips to the United States for musical engagements, for conducting and things like that. Through that, it was really those trips that he became attuned to the system of racial segregation. He was meeting political figures, civil rights activists. He was getting more involved, reading books. So those trips were really, really important. His fame was growing, and a lot of ensembles actually came to know his music and perform his music. Some of those ensembles were named after him. There's a lot of Samuel Coleridge-Taylor ensembles, but the most famous one that a lot of times you might hear talked of is the Samuel Coleridge-Taylor Choral Society of Washington. So his musical career was fruitful. He was very famous. He was invited to the White House to dine with important political figures, and he broke a lot of boundaries. He worked in mainly white circles. During that time, White House would only admit famous figures, musicians or otherwise, from white circles. So he dined there, and he was part of those circles. So he was one of the first to break those barriers, and he was extremely famous. But again, I hope these conversations will bring his voice back and also bring his music back to stage. So his training was in classical music. He went to RCM, so by its very nature, it was classical training. But we see that he had a lot of interest in folk music, and he took a lot of inspiration from Dvorak. We have a quote by him that he says, Dvorak was my first love. He slowly, especially after his graduation from RCM, he starts reading African American literature. He met up with Paul Laurence Dunbar. He set some of his poetry to music, and he also starts experimenting with the music itself, with rhythms, with different musical idioms, and he tries to borrow from different musical genres. He tries to kind of blend different things into the classical music that he was writing. Six Sorrow Songs was a song cycle of 6 songs that he published in 1904. This song cycle had never been discussed or analyzed in musicological research, so my research was the first to do that actually, and to put emphasis on the importance of this song cycle and year 1904. So he published this cycle a few months before he went to the United States for the very first time by sea. During the same year, he told his first biographer that he was reading Souls of Black Folk, and he called it the best book he has ever read. The book is a seminal book by Du Bois. In that book, there is a chapter called Sorrow Songs. Sorrow songs, the term is interchangeable with slave songs or spirituals, and that was the very first time that Coleridge-Taylor came across the term sorrow songs. And as you see, it's the same name of the song cycle as well. So I drew connections, between the two. The poetry is by Christina Rossetti, who was, they were alive during the same time, Samuel Coleridge-Taylor and Christina Rossetti, but it seems they never met. Christina Rossetti's music was known amongst RCM students and professors, so it wasn't something unknown. We know that also in 1904, Coleridge-Taylor owned the complete poetry, the completed poem editions of Christina Rossetti that had just come out. The poetry includes a lot of imagery, a lot of symbolism, veiled language, language of flowers, where every flower stands for a specific meaning. Coleridge-Taylor was aware of all of these things. He was an avid poetry reader, just like his mom. We have accounts of him reading poetry and just walking in nature to allow himself to kind of digest it, and he memorized a lot of poetry. In Christina Rossetti's writings, they're very religious as well, or at least there is a lot of spiritual undercurrents. And there's a lot of different layers. The poetry seems simple at first glance. It's very accessible, but the more you kind of dig and analyze, the deeper it gets. And Coleridge-Taylor was very well aware of all these different layers. So I thought maybe we could listen to one of the songs from the 6 Star Songs. I'm just going to stop sharing. Welcome everybody. I see new people have joined us. So let me know if you can hear it. Do you hear it?
She sat and sang alway by the green margin of a stream, watching the fishes leap and play beneath the glad sunbeam. I sat and wept alway 'neath the moon's most shadowy beam, watching the blossoms of the May weep leaves, the blossoms weep leaves into the stream.
Perfect. I'm going to share my screen again. So just listening to those few pages, anything in particular that grabs your attention? You can write it in the chat if you'd like. Is it similar to other vocal art songs you've heard? Is it different? How is it different? What do you think the poetry is about? What was interesting about it? How is the piano's role? Is it accompanying? Is it supportive? Or is it its own voice commenting on the story? Mysterious sounding, yes. Why is it mysterious sounding? Can you identify why? So it is mysterious sounding because the song is in pentatonic scale. It has pentatonic elements in it. Long melodic lines, yes, very long. Did you notice that the piano repeats the vocal line one measure in delay? Although it is in delay, harmonies are perfectly matching. So it seems piano has its own voice. It's very active. It's a very active commentator. I just wanted to give you a little taste of one of the songs, but I definitely encourage you to listen to all of them. And that was sung by Elizabeth Llewellyn. I've included her website here and a link to all of her albums, including this one. So I'll send you all of these links for sure. The album is called Heart and Hereafter. The entire album is dedicated to Samuel Coleridge-Taylor's songs. There's a lot of songs, so feel free to explore them and sing them, listen to them. She was producing a few videos as part of her album release campaign, and she had reached out to my co-supervisor and myself to kind of contribute to it. So I ended up being in one of the videos talking a little bit just about the whole cycle and how Coleridge-Taylor kind of masterfully, subtly blends two genres of art songs and summer songs. So the main point of my thesis was that I really wanted to point out the connections, but also point out the ways in which he was using genre blending, art song and sorrow songs. My work was interdisciplinary in a way that I analyzed the poetry and the music, and then I looked at both of them, the musical literary hybrid, to see what kind of new layers of meaning gets created when they're both put together. Sometimes you read a poem, you might think a specific way about it, but as soon as a composer comments on it and sets it to music, all of a sudden it might explore new things. I had also offered interpretation of each song, but also the whole cycle as well. And I didn't want my thesis to just be for academics or for researchers. I really wanted it to be a resource for singers who either want to sing this song cycle or want to know how to approach some of Coleridge-Taylor's vocal music. If you're not super into music but you like poetry, I also wanted to have this as a resource to those. If you're a teacher, conductor, or somebody who teaches, this would also be a good resource for you, and I'll be sure to send you a link to that. So Coleridge-Taylor wrote a lot of music. His instrumental music is much more well known. You might have heard some chamber music by him, maybe orchestral music, and especially now, more and more ensembles are doing his music. He wrote incidental music, a lot of choral music, one opera also that we thought was previously lost, but it isn't. He wrote over 100 vocal pieces. How many of those do we know? Probably very few. So I wanted to urge you to listen to them and sing them. They're beautiful. I must say that I haven't studied all of his music, but the ones that I have studied, they are not usually accessible for beginner ensembles or beginner singers. But what you could do is to talk to a composer or an arranger so that they could arrange some of these pieces for your ensemble or for yourself at a level that you're comfortable with. So after this webinar, you're going to receive an email from me with resources and links to a few things that I mentioned. My thesis, those websites that I mentioned, this recording, as well as a link to future webinars and future topics. All of these webinars are short and sweet. I'm aware of Zoom fatigue and everybody's competing priorities. If there is anything that you'd like to engage with more or learn more about, like reading his first biography or reading his wife's book, his daughter's book, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be sure to send you a link to that.